Could you see the big bad mighty love Selassie, you know, want to set up respect reaching out to the promoter Selassie, you know, make it possible. No matter how small the crowd is, we enjoy ourselves here. Yeah, Selassie, you know. So big up all who just arriving at the house. Yeah.
Oh, salam tana, tina yistalin. Sinbet, salam, Shabbat shalom. Greetings, Ine, Aras, Yadinos, Teferi, Name. Greetings, this is Wendem Machu, Yadon. This is Aras Yadon, Aras Yadinos, Teferi of the line of Judah Society of His Imperial Majesty. Now, greetings, my brothers and sisters. Greetings, my brothers and sisters. We are, as you should already know, we're in the fourth book of Moses, the fourth book of Muse, the Torah of our sabbatical, our Sabbath, sabbatical readings and the sabbatical reading portions. We are in the Orit weekly, or the weekly Orit, the reading and the feedings from the book of Numbers, from Orit Zechulk, in the Ge'ez and in the Royal Amharic of the Revised Amharic Bible of Kedamawi Haile Selassie Nagusa Negestachin, is called Orit Zechulk. It's the fourth book of Moses, and it's called Numbers. Now, Zechulk, it means the Qatara, the Sayami, the naming or the nomenclature of this particular book, the Ase Yayamu Metafu Siyamewina Yagenyo Be Mi'raf and Haya Sidistalai Kata Wesau Yet Tulidoch Quaterano. This is the numbering of the generation. And in verse 26, it says, of the children of Judah by their generations, after their families, by the house of their fathers, according to the number of the names, from 20 years old and upward, all that were able to go forth to war. Then in verse 27 of chapter 1 of Numbers, it says, of the children, it says, those that were numbered, those that were numbered of them, even of the tribe of Judah, were 314,600. Now, this particular book is the book of Numbers, and it's the fourth book of Moses. Now, this Senbet, or this Shabbat, or today is the first day of the week, because we, even ourselves, because of the work that's upon us, the spirit is willing, but the flesh, the flesh is weak. The flesh has its limitations, even though in spirit there's so much that we wanted to communicate and share, even over this past week, even regarding this particular book of Numbers, since this is now the second portion from the book of Numbers, and the 35th Senbet, or Senbet Salasa Amistenyauen. This is the 35th. Now, we've entered into this particular book of Numbers, and Numbers signify the accounting. Numbers signifies the accountability. And it's very important for us to understand how in this discipleship, because this is the discipleship, some are just listening to these proclamations, these teachings out of curiosity, and that is good. If they are curious of what the teachings of His Imperial Majesty and Rastafari revelation is all about, that is good. You understand? This is what we are to do, is to proclaim the good news. You understand? But for us who are within the household of faith, we must grow. We must grow up into Him in all things. And this is where the fellowship, this is important for us to understand the difference between the preaching, which to preach to all creatures, and the fellowship that is within the family of the King of Kings and His Christ. That distinction needs to be understood, especially by the brotherhood, especially by I and I, especially by the household of faith. That distinction needs to be understood. We heard one particular Messianic Ethiopian Hebrew brother representing another community, another camp, say that, we preach to all, but we fellowship with those few. You understand? We fellowship. See, the fellowship and to preach is two different things, because many want to fellowship, but they're not up to the standard of fellowship. There's a certain standard of there's a certain accountability. Let's keep it on message. There's a certain accountability, and orit zet hulqu, as it's known in the Ge'ez and as it's known in the Royal Amharic of Haile Selassie I's Revised Amharic Bible, or what we know as the Arab. We call it the Arab. The R, Revised, the A, Amharic, and Bible. It's the authorized 1961 Kadamawi Haile Selassie Amharic Bible. It's I Metaf Kedus. It's the book of the seven seals for the elect Rastafari. But the basic teaching is right here in the Bible. You understand, in the Schofield, as the Dekam as Amorid, and those who've been paying attention to these teachings know that the English that we consult, that is the basic teaching. In other words, this is the basic boot camp. You understand, the basic boot camp for discipleship is the Schofield, consists of the Schofield Study Bible, or what's also known as the Schofield Reference Bible. And for more information about which particular books, and even to download some of the free PDFs, you can go to www.lojsociety.org. Now, we're in the 35th. You understand, the 35th Sabbatical reading and feeding. Now, let us first of all just, before moving forward, it is necessary for us to remember, reflect, you understand, on that which has already preceded. You understand, as it's known that one needs to understand what the history is. So before we go forward and we look at the vision that the Almighty has set before us or the feet, we need to just make sure that we're building on His foundation and need to reflect. You understand, to reflect on what has already preceded. Now, we're in the 4th book of Moses, which is called Numbers. So what we're going to seek to do in this particular teaching is to touch on the 34th again, to review the 34th. It's important for us to review the book of Numbers, the book of accountability, and to recognize what this book is saying to us and what this book is pointing out to us, and in truth, what this book is teaching us. You understand? There's a teaching and an application for us who are of the household of faith, not just the curious folks, not the subscribers or ones who just want to hear and learn and maybe debate something. You understand? But for those of us who already have been born again to Him, those of us who have accepted, you understand, who have accepted the call, who have answered affirmatively, those who have affirmatively answered that and are seeking to build and to grow in that and to come out, as the Beta Israel also came out. But we have to learn from their experience. It's important for us to learn from their experience, because right now, the once lost but now found Beta Israel, even in this present day and time, the so-called Ethiopian Hebrews, and even many of us as the elect Rastafari, we are at that very same point in time. This is what's so mystical about this particular time that we're living in. This is 2011. You understand? This is 2011, and this is the first day. This is the first day, the Ehud, and we're reviewing the Senbet, the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath reading, which is really for this week. So in other words, we remember to keep the Senbet holy. We rest, we reflect, we read, and then when we gather, in other words, the beginning and the ending are the most important times. So you cannot come together in the true Meshahawian, or the true Christina way, you understand, on that first day, which they call in the West Sunday, but we know as Ehud, if you don't keep the seventh day, which is the Senbet. So when we say we keep the Senbet or the Sabbath, that does not mean that the first day, Ehud, which is Sunday, is not important to us. Some Gentiles and other mixed up and confused people may think that's what we mean. But in holy Kidestitu Ethiopia, in holy Ethiopia, in true Ethiopia, from such a time, you understand, until the great transgression and the rebellion against the King of Kings, the Sabbath, the seventh day Kedame Sabbath, was kept as it was commanded by the Almighty, and the King of Kings even has kept the Sabbath day and the gathering on that first day. You understand, as we know in the Hawariyat, amongst the apostles, they also kept and gathered on the first day. So that seventh day and that first day is very important. But you cannot say you are keeping the first day as a so-called Christian and you don't keep the Sabbath, the seventh day, because the beginning and the end, or the end and the beginning, are very important. There's a connection there. So this is just a point of order right here. But let's go over this fourth book of Moses, which is called, in the English, which is called Numbers, and let us review why is this book important to us, and what are we to learn from this book, and what application can we apply in this present dispensation. You understand? In this present dispensation. Now, the book, it derives its name from the fact that it records the enumeration of Israel. It records the enumeration of the Bani Yisrael, of the Beta Israel. Historically, Numbers, it takes up the story where the book of Exodus left it, and is the book of the wilderness wanderings. My brothers and sisters, my fellow disciples, take notes. We've reminded ones and ones, and we will continue to do so. Take good notes. This is the book of the wilderness wanderings of the redeemed people, consequent upon their failure to enter the land at Kadesh Barnea, because the redeemed people, and when we look at our history as so-called African Americans and so-called black people, Afro-Hispanic and Afro-Caribbean people in this region and hemisphere, in this North Country, and recognize who we are and what our history in the past 40 to 50 years, we can see that our people for the past 40 years have also wandered in the wilderness. We're still wandering in this wilderness of North America as this redeemed people, you understand, consequent upon our collective failure to come out of Babylon, you understand, to come out of this spiritual Egypt and to enter the land, enter into our homeland, our promised land at Kadesh Barnea. It's one and the same thing, my people. This is why the Almighty said through the prophets, in the latter days, In the latter days, we would understand this perfectly. You understand? It's becoming crystal clear to those who are willing to receive. Now, typically, it is the book of service. This is a note. It is the book of Agelgalot, is the book of service and the Akahed. Service, Agelgalot, Tana, Akahed. It's the book of service and walk. And thus completes, there's a completion here with the preceding books, a beautiful moral order. The last video that we posted concerning the sabbatical readings and feedings was speaking about sirat, the word sirat, and how that word reflects order as well as system. You understand? We use this word in Ethiopic computing today, as in the English you would say system. In Ethiopic computing they use the word sirat. And Surat in the scriptural order, in the biblical order of the Metzhaf Kedus, it is order. You understand? So we have order, keep those key words, order and system. That's wrapped up in the Ethiopic word and the Amharic word Surat. So this book that we have entered into in this particular sabbatical, the annual sabbatical cycle, and we're going to cover, as we said already, 34 and 35. We're reviewing 34 again, and we're going to go into, Yah willing, 35, which is this particular week's reading and feeding. You understand? The reading and feeding. Now, this is a book of service and walk, Agelgalotna Akahed, and it completes with the preceding books a beautiful moral order, a beautiful moral theocratic order. Genesis is the book of the creation and the fall. Exodus is of redemption. Leviticus is of worship and fellowship. This is the key. Worship and fellowship. Now, numbers of that which follow is service and walk. So it's important for us to understand the moral order and what each of these 5 books of Muse, 5 books of Moses speaks of. Genesis is the book of creation and fall. Exodus is of redemption. Leviticus is of worship and fellowship. Remember we said we can preach to all creatures. We're to preach the good news, the gospel, the King of Kings and his Christ to all the creatures. But we can only fellowship with our brothers and our mothers and our sisters. We can only fellowship with those who are part of the family. So that decision to become part of the family of the King of Kings and his Christ, it begins with that metanoia, begins with that repentance. It begins with studying to show thyself approved. It begins with the I, you understand, and the Most High and his word. You understand? So the I and meditating on the word of the Most High in order to be able to fellowship with I and I. Now, it is important to see that nothing was or nothing is to be left to self-will. And this is the big stumbling block for many of the potential brethren and sisterin out there. You understand? There's still a lot of self-will. You understand? Ones are trying to rethink the Almighty's order instead of submitting themselves and learning of his order and seeing how it applies and how it answers to all of our needs. Now, every servant, each and every servant was numbered. Each and every servant must be accounted for. So when we talk about numbers, keep in mind that numbers reflect accounting. You count with numbers, don't you? And accountability. You know what I'm saying? So each and every servant, if you're truly a servant, not a self-will servant, say, yes, I doing Jah works, and you're doing your own thing and you're calling it Jah works. That's self-will. Every true servant was numbered or accounted for and knew his place. knew his place in the family, knew his place in the Beta Seb. So you got to know what is your place in the family of God in Christ. What is your place in the lodge, in this society of His Imperial Majesty, and had his own definitely assigned service. So each one must have their service. You understand? What role do you play in the society of His Imperial Majesty? What role do you play in the family? You understand? Or you just playing like you're part of the family? See, these things are being cut off. These things are being cut off. All this nonsense that a lot of us have been involved in. If we're not willing to show ourselves approved, study and show ourselves approved to God, you understand, as what? Workmen? You understand? As workmen? You know what I'm saying? It's one and the same message here, my brothers and sisters. So it's important that each and every one of us have to be accountable. You understand? And have to know what our place is in the family, not our own little personal families. Because a lot of us are caught up in our little personal families, and that's good. You understand? If it's in God. If it's in Jah, if it's in His will, but if it's in your own self-will, that right there is your cross. That right there is your stumbling stone. That right there is the object of offense. Every servant, and we as students are those servants, because as disciples, you understand, we're learning. Disciples is that basic boot camp. You know what I'm saying? We're learning, well, what is the basic training? You know what I'm saying? One has to be trained. You know what I'm saying? So up to this particular point, and this particular book right here, we can consider the former books part of that civilian citizenship. You understand? When we're speaking about being Beta Israel, when we're speaking about we as Ethiopian Hebrews and elect Rastafari and coming out, we are speaking about nationhood. You understand? Divine, God ordained nationhood. When we talk about community and family, these are other relative words to the big picture of the Almighty. He wanted a nation of the priesthood, a kingdom of priests. You know what I'm saying? A kingdom of priests, not to go around and, you know, like you see men and people and that nonsense, but according to His will. So we have to learn what His will is so we can fulfill what His will. You know what I'm saying? And stop doing like a lot of brothers and sisters and others out there. They overly spiritualize things like, yes, it feels eerie, you know, like in some way that doesn't agree with His will. In other words, humble yourself, but you have to be born again. You see, you can't do it until you acknowledge. You know what I'm saying? Until you acknowledge yourself. You got to get over yourself. You got to acknowledge, you understand, yourself. You got to know yourself, and when you know yourself, you know that you need to be born again. You need to be conformed to His will. Get out of your will. You'll recognize that doing it your way instead of doing it Yahweh or Jah's way, if you please, has been the cause of so much backwardness and the lack of progress. So we as a Rastafari community, the Line of Jew Society of His Imperial Majesty, we are speaking progressively. But we recognize that there's no easy road, you understand? But it is much easier, His road and His way, than doing it our own ways. You understand? Many of us have had to recognize that really the hard way. You understand? And not to go into a personal testimony at this time, because each one of us probably has a personal testimony. But let's get into His testimony, His word. So now they said a New Testament parallel to this is 1 Corinthians chapter 12. I want you to make a note of that, and we'll hopefully go over this, but some of your homework, go over that. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is a parallel to what we're saying right here, that it's important that we see that nothing is being left to self-will. You understand? Every servant was numbered. Every servant must be accountable. Every servant of the King of Kings and His Christ must be accountable. Every laborer, every co-laborer, everyone must know their place in the family and have his own definitely assigned service. It's definitely a sign service. So now we're about to get into a level of teaching that is not just the civilian teaching or the Salamawi teaching, but now we're getting into the Wetadarawi or the military order. There's a military order. We talk about the church triumphant, but the church triumphant is connected with in the theocratic concepts. If you're not familiar, go look this up. That there's the church triumphant and there's the church militant. At this point of numbers, we're about to move into the militancy, you understand, of the church, and we'll explain as we go forward. Now, the second typical lesson is a second type of lesson that needs to be learned in this fourth book of Moses that's called Orit Zechulukwa, you understand, or Numbers, and in the Hebrew it's known as Bemidbar. That's interesting, Bemidbar. Why is that interesting? Because Bemidbar means in the wilderness. In the wilderness. Bamarinya, we say Bemidrebeda. Bemidrebeda. In the wilderness of Sinai, in the wilderness of Sinai, which is the 34th portion, the 34th kuful or parasha or parsha in the Hebrew, parsha, bamarinya, kuful, you understand, which is the 34th portion, which begins off the book of Numbers within our annual Hebraic reading of Torah, reading of the Orit and studying of the Orit. Now, the second type of lesson is this: tested by wilderness circumstances. We're being tested by the wilderness circumstances of this here North America. And when we look at ourselves as a people, as a collective and individually, you understand, being tested by these wilderness circumstances. Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he said it, and others said it. Maybe y'all didn't get it, you understand? But he said it. He testified that we're in the wilderness, that this great people that he called the tribe of Shabazz, the Nation of Islam during the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's time, they call this great nation people the tribe of Shabazz. But did you know that the tribe of Shabazz is a true Beta Israel, is a true black Jews, is true Ethiopian Hebrews? That's who we are. You understand? We're that people that this scripture is speaking about. The once lost but now found Beta Israel. And the second typical lesson that needs to be learned is tested by wilderness circumstances. The Beta Israel, I and I ancestors utterly failed. Have utterly failed. And this is what we've been talking on. We've been speaking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the so-called civil rights movement and the predicament that black folks are in, even though we have a black president, and that may make a lot of folks feel good and become a little bit spiritually distracted and not recognizing what their divine responsibility is. You understand? And here we are in the wilderness of the Americas and the Caribbean, and don't recognize that being tested by these wilderness circumstances, that we as the Beta Israel, we as the lost sheep of the house of Israel have utterly failed. We have utterly failed. Utterly failed. We failed to enter the land at the Kadesh Barnea, at that Kadesh Barnea. And the Kadesh Barnea was when Shashamene land was opened to us 40 plus years ago. Our people, our ancestors, they utterly failed to enter into the land. You understand? And for most of the average folks, they didn't even know anything about this. But we blame the leadership. You understand? We blame the leadership. The leadership is definitely to be blamed. And when we look at, well, who was the leadership? That's that civil rights leadership. Now, a whole big boo-hoo-hoo-hoo and brouhaha is being made over civil rights because of a couple of Negroes, N-words that have made it. But the state of black people, you understand, in the Americas and the Caribbean in this present time is dreadful. You don't understand. It's a dreadful situation. We got the prison industrial complex. We have all this unemployment and bad education. You understand? We have the drugs and the violence. You understand? And what's happening to our young people? Our young people falling in the street and just falling for all the ills of this spiritual Egypt. My people, let us go forward in this teaching right here. Just to this overview, Numbers has 5 chief divisions. The first and the foremost is the order of the host. The order of the host. Secondly, is from Sinai to the Kadesh Barnea. So as it was in the beginning, so shall it be in the end. We have another opportunity, my people. You understand? The word prophetically says that there's going to be a small remnant. There will be a remnant that will be saved, but the question is, will we be of that remnant? You understand? How well we study and show ourselves approved. You understand? And become conformed to the image of His Son, of Getachin Namet Hanatachin Jesus Christos. That's what really determines whether we are numbered in that number. So we have, thirdly, is Israel at the Kadesh Barnea. Then we have the fourth part is the wilderness wanderings. And it's interesting how we look at it scripturally. And when our eyes are opened and we can see, well, what has really happened to black folks and black people in the Americas and the Caribbean over these past 40 years. It's very, very interesting. Then the fifth part is the closing. There are closing instructions. There are closing instructions. Now, this is a basic overview of the book of Numbers and Sabbatical 34, the RSS, Rastafari Sabbatical Studies. You understand? Our Sabbath house readings and our Sabbatical studies for the 34th, which opens up this particular book that's known in the Hebrew as Bemidbar and in the Royal Amharic as Bemidrebeda. Bemidrebeda. But let's go just a little bit, you understand, a little bit deeper into this right here, into this particular book. Now, there is a beautiful order of arrangement here. Now, from the Torah, it is Numbers chapter 1 for the 34th Sabbatical reading. You understand, the Sabbatical reading and the portion for Sabbath 34th, which was last week. You understand, we're in Sabbath 35, but we're just going on an overview of this, was Numbers chapter 1 to Numbers chapter 4 and 20. And this whole section is speaking about order. It's speaking about order. Order, 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 order. You understand? And that shows us that we too must get our house, our Father's house, in order. Every servant must be accountable to the King of Kings and His Christ, and accountable to the brothers and the sisters and the mothers in our community and in our family who are accountable to the King of Kings and His Christ. Everyone must know what their place is in the family of and this household of faith, and have to have his own definitely assigned service. This is what Sabbath 34 in the wilderness, Bemidrebeda, Midbar speaks of, as it explains the order of the hosts. Moses commanded to number the people. As we go on, we find in chapter 2, the order of the hosts continue, the arrangement of the camp. The arrangement, what is the arrangement of our camp? See, and there's much practical knowledge here. You understand? This is not just theoretical we are studying here. You understand? But of course, as in boot camp, first you study the theories. And then you have to get out there. You understand? And then actually do the exercises. You understand? So we have to learn this as well as possible. You understand? As well as possible, because our very lives will depend on this. Will depend on how well we learn and how well in spirit and in truth we apply this. Now, chapter 3 speaks about the order of the host, the priests. In chapter 3, the order of the host, the tribe of Levi. Chapter 3, the order of the host, the families of Levi. And we're up to part 6 here. In chapter 3, the order of the host, the charge. There's a charge or order that are given to the sons of Lewi. Then we have, as the 7th part, the order of the host. We have the firstborn redeemed. Now that connects with Exodus chapter 38 and 27, and there's a note there. That's for those who don't recall or just studied this. You know, part of this is not just to listen to what we're saying here, but to hear what we're teaching, and then to make the time in the week, you understand, to go over and to study these things. And then we have opportunity to fellowship, even if it's a call conference fellowship, you understand, as a first step, you understand, to coming face to face. But we have to know, well, who to fellowship with. So if ones cannot humble themselves, you understand, to learn his way, then why should I and I waste I and I time or risk I and I safety with those who are not submitting to the will of his imperial majesty in Christ, or risk their safety as well? You understand? So now in chapter 4, the order of the host, the 8th part is the service of the Kohathites. Then we have the order of the host, the office of Eleazar. And then it ends at verse 20. Ends at verse 20 when it says, but they shall not go in to see when the holy things are covered, lest they die. They are not to go in to see when the holy things are covered. You understand? So there's a separation between the Kiddush and the Urkus. There must be a separation between that which is set apart or holy and that which is profaned. Now, it is from verse 21 of chapter 4 that actually we continue, where the order of the host, now the 10th part, is the service of the Gershonites. The Gershonites. And this, the 35th now sabbatical, is what we're going to take up in the next part of this. So my brothers and sisters, stay tuned. The 35th sabbatical reading and portion coming up, Yah willing. So stay tuned, my brothers and sisters. Senbet Salam, Shabbat Shalom.
Come again. Welcome down, Gritty. Can you see the big bad mighty love Selassie? You know, want to set up respect reaching out to the promoter Selassie, you know, make it possible. No matter how small the crowd is, we enjoy ourselves here. Yeah, Selassie, you know. So big up all who just arriving at the house. Yeah. can you see the big bad mighty love, Selassie, you know, want to send up respect reaching out to the promoter, Selassie, you know, make it possible. No matter how small the crowd is, we enjoy ourselves here. Yeah, Selassie, you know. So big up all who just arriving at the house. Yeah.
Atetele nega neskala idale nigi tako motkara tagle demu